Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a very specific and honestly deeply tragic case file. We all know the famous story of the RMS Titanic, right? The legendary ship that met a disastrous end. But today, we aren't just looking at this as a sad piece of history. We're going to treat this as a full-on forensic investigative report into massive maritime safety failures. I mean, think about it. How does a vessel, universally praised as the absolute apex of modern engineering, end up at the bottom of the ocean on its very first trip? What were the cascading system failures, the mechanical flaws, and frankly, the regulatory negligence that caused thousands of lives to be forever changed in just a few short hours?
Well, the root cause of this massive disaster begins with a single, incredibly dangerous word: unsinkable. The operating company, White Star Line, and the shipbuilders were so ridiculously confident in their engineering that they practically guaranteed the ship could never, ever go down. And this wasn't just some clever marketing slogan, you know. This pure hubris was baked right into the operational mindset of the entire crew, effectively blinding them to actual, real-world risk. It created this profound false sense of security that trickled down from the architects all the way to the passengers walking up the gangway. It really is the central paradox of our investigation today. How exactly did the unsinkable ship sink?
So let's open the dossier and lay out the evidence. First, we'll look at the unsinkable myth. Then, the night of the collision. Next, the engineering failures. After that, the lifeboat shortage. And finally, changing maritime laws forever. All right, jumping into part one, the unsinkable myth and that fatal false sense of security.
So picture this, the year is 1912, and the Titanic is literally the largest and most magnificent ship the world has ever seen. On April 10th, she departs from Southampton, England, heading straight for New York City. Now 2,200. That number represents the sheer human scale of our case study. That's how many passengers and crew members were on board for this maiden voyage. The ship was basically a floating palace. We're talking unprecedented luxury, grand dining halls, a swimming pool, every modern convenience you could possibly imagine. But this sets up a really stark dichotomy between extreme luxury and a total complete lack of safety oversight. You really have to imagine the atmosphere here. Passengers were sipping champagne in these lavish first-class lounges, completely unaware that their unsinkable fortress was steaming right toward an active ice field.
Moving on to part two, the night of the collision, the ignored warnings.
Our investigation reveals a staggering instance of gross negligence happening on the night of April 14, 1912. The conditions out on the ocean were highly deceptive that night. The sea was incredibly calm, almost like glass, and the sky was crystal clear. But the temperature was absolutely freezing. And here's the kicker. Throughout the journey, the Titanic actually received multiple warnings from other ships about massive icebergs right in their path. Yet, they kept pushing forward at nearly full speed. Why? Well, the ship's wireless operators were completely swamped, sending out personal messages for elite passengers. The backlog was so heavy that when another ship tried to send an urgent ice warning, the Titanic's operator literally replied, "Shut up, I am busy." Let that sink in. They were speeding through a known hazard zone in the dead of night, completely blinded by their own overconfidence.
When we follow the forensic timeline, you see exactly how quickly things deteriorated. After ignoring those crucial warnings all day long, the inevitable happens. At exactly 11:40 p.m., lookouts suddenly spot a massive iceberg directly in the ship's path. They sound the alarm, and the crew desperately tries to turn this massive vessel. But a mere 37 seconds elapse between spotting the iceberg and the actual collision. 37 seconds. It is just not enough time. The iceberg scrapes violently along the right or starboard side of the ship. Now, to the passengers, the impact barely registers. It felt like a slight shudder. But beneath the surface, the ocean water is violently rushing in. By 2:20 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, the immense strain proves to be too much. The ship breaks right in two and sinks to the bottom of the Atlantic. Which brings us to part three.
The engineering failures.
A design defeated.
So, you might be wondering, how does a glancing blow take down such a behemoth? Well, the core of the ship's safety profile relied on a very specific fail-safe mechanism: 16 watertight compartments. Basically, the ship's lower hull was divided into these distinct sections. The engineers were absolutely certain that even if the hull was breached in a head-on collision and a few of these sections filled with water, the overall buoyancy of the vessel would easily remain intact. But there was a massive, single-point vulnerability in this design. The walls or bulkheads separating these compartments went high up into the ship, sure, but they did not extend all the way to the ceiling. And here is where the devastating gap between theory and reality becomes painfully clear. The intended design was meant to withstand an isolated puncture, But the reality? The reality of an iceberg scraping a massive gash along the entire side of the ship meant that multiple watertight compartments were sliced open all at once. And because those bulkheads didn't reach the ceiling, the water continuously flooded in, weighing down the front of the ship and simply spilling over the tops of the walls from one compartment to the very next. It's kind of like water filling an ice cube tray. It was at this exact moment that Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, did the math right there on the spot. He delivered the fatal diagnosis directly to Captain E.J. Smith. The ship was mathematically doomed. There was no saving it.
Now for part 4, the lifeboat shortage and the true human cost. While the mechanical failure was undeniably severe, it's really the human oversight that turned a sinking ship into a historic massacre. I want you to think about this for a second. In an investigation absolutely filled with ignored warnings, excessive speed, and compromised hull designs, what was the absolute biggest, most fatal systemic mistake of the entire night? The answer points to a catastrophic regulatory failure. There simply were not enough lifeboats for everyone on board, not even close. But the why is what makes this a true investigative focal point. See, the British Board of Trade's maritime regulations were woefully, terribly outdated. They actually based the required number of lifeboats on the overall tonnage of the ship rather than its actual passenger capacity. So ironically, the Titanic was actually carrying more lifeboats than the law strictly required. This exposes a massive, fatal systemic loophole in global safety standards of the time. And to make matters infinitely worse, there had been 0 proper lifeboat drills. So as panic and chaos erupted on the decks, crew members didn't even know the boat's weight capacities. Because of this, many lifeboats were launched into the freezing ocean only half full. Families were literally torn apart by a failure of protocol just as much as a failure of engineering. When the math was finally tallied, and that freezing night gave way to dawn, the human toll of all those cascading failures was just staggering. After about 2.5 hours of a terrifying struggle in the dark, the final numbers were locked in. Out of the 2,200 souls on board, more than 1,500 people lost their lives. Only around 700 were saved by the lifeboats. It instantly became one of the greatest maritime tragedies in recorded history, and it shifted the entire world's perspective on industrial progress practically overnight.
Finally, Part 5, Changing Maritime Laws Forever, the Systemic Reforms.
An event of this massive magnitude shook the entire world to its core, and it forced authorities to take a really hard forensic look at their deeply flawed maritime systems. The investigation into the Titanic led directly to sweeping, systemic safety reforms that actually still govern our oceans today. Laws were entirely rewritten from the ground up. It became strictly mandatory for every single vessel to carry enough lifeboats for every single passenger and crew member on board, shutting down that ridiculous tonnage loophole for good. Furthermore, strict ice monitoring protocols were established. This led directly to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, an organization that is still out there operating today to track icebergs. And finally, wireless communication systems were mandated to be manned 24 hours a day, leading to the landmark SOLAS, or Safety of Life at Sea Treaty. This ensured that distress signals would never, ever again be ignored just so someone could send a passenger telegram.
Today, well over a century later, the wreckage of the Titanic still rests quietly in the extreme, dark depths of the Atlantic Ocean. But as this explainer shows, the story of the Titanic is far, far more than just a sad tale of a sunken ship. It stands as an eternal, incredibly powerful audit on the dangers of human overconfidence, the inherent limits of technology, and the overwhelming, wildly unpredictable power of nature. So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. In our modern rush to constantly build bigger, faster, and smarter systems, are we truly learning from the regulatory and systemic failures of the Titanic? Or are we just inventing brand new ways to call ourselves unsinkable? Thank you so much for exploring this dossier with me. Keep asking questions and always keep looking beneath the surface.